Hi, Andy with you again. Back to finish off what we were looking at in terms of David's relationship with Joab. So last time we were focusing on events back in 2 Samuel chapters 2 and 3, and particularly these words from the end of chapter 3. So I'm reading from verse 38 onwards. Then the king said to his men, "Do you not realize that a prince and a great man has fallen in Israel this day? And today, though I am the anointed king, I am weak. And these sons of Zeruiah are too strong for me. May the Lord repay the evildoer according to his evil deeds." So these were the words of King David. The man who had fallen was Abner, son of Ner, who had been murdered by the sons of Zeruiah, Joab and his brother Abishai. And on that occasion, David had failed to deal with them. And he'd expressed this feeling that they were too strong for him. And we were thinking about what he meant by that. We were thinking about how it may have been a family issue, a family loyalty issue, because these guys were related to David. We were thinking about how he might feel dependent on them because they were important leaders in Judah's army. We thought maybe there was some loyalty there because they'd been with David a long time. But whatever the reason, David failed to take the action he should have taken in response to this serious crime of murder. And this fact is underlined as we move on into chapter 4, because chapter 4 tells of the murder, again, of the king of the northern faction. So David's opposite number, as it were, the man called Ishbosheth. Chapter 4 tells us how 2 men snuck into Ishbosheth's house and murdered him, cut off his head and took it to David, thinking that this death of a rival would somehow curry favour with King David. They couldn't have been more wrong, because on this occasion, David punishes the murder. David does what he should have done with Joab and Abishai, but failed to do. He has them executed. So this just underlines a double standard, really, on the part of David, that there was an action he should have dealt with Joab, with Abishai, but didn't. And we saw this as kind of a critical point in the relationship, where maybe, if you like, things had come to a head, where David's had failed to deal with Joab's violent tendencies. But it gets worse in a way. As we read on from chapter 4, David becomes king over the united factions, south and north, so he becomes king over a united Israel. He defeats the Philistines, the ark is brought to Jerusalem, the Ark of the Covenant. Then we have David's other victories, David and some of the other characters in the kingdom defeating the Ammonites, and we get to chapter 11, which is perhaps the darkest chapter in David's entire life. In this chapter, we read how David has an affair with somebody else's wife. David has an affair with Bathsheba. He sleeps with her. He gets her pregnant. Now, the woman's husband, Uriah, is a soldier, and he's away at the front, and David has stayed behind in Jerusalem. Now, Uriah comes back on leave, and David tries to get Uriah to sleep with his wife so they can kind of cover up the sin, so that people will think that the child she's carrying will in fact be Uriah's child. But it doesn't happen. Uriah doesn't do that. And David then resorts to covering up his crime with an even greater crime. He arranges Uriah's death. He arranges to have him killed. And who does he turn to do this? he turns to Joab. Perhaps because Joab is in a position of military command over the troops in the field, including Uriah, but perhaps because he knows that Joab will get it done. So David writes to Joab in 2 Samuel chapter 11 and verse 14. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. So he actually gives this letter to the woman's husband to take back to Joab in the field. In it he wrote, "Put Uriah in the front line where the fighting is fiercest. Then withdraw from him so that he will be struck down and die. Arrange this man's death for me, please." And Joab obliges. So he puts Uriah at a place where the fighting is fiercest, where he knows the strongest defenders of the city are. And when they came out and fight, Uriah is killed. Not only Uriah, but some other men are killed as well. So it's not just Uriah who dies, but some of David's own troops alongside Uriah are also killed. And Joab sends an account of the battle back to David, and he's a little bit cautious because he's not sure if David is going to be upset about the fact that not just Uriah but a number of other soldiers have also been killed. And he tells the messenger, as he gives David the news, to add a little follow-on to say, if he asks you, say to him, also, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead. So the messenger sets out in verse 22 of 2 Samuel 11. And when he gets to David, he tells him everything that Joab had instructed him to say. The messenger says to David, "The men overpowered us and came out against us in the open, but we drove them back to the entrance to the city gate. Then the archers shot arrows at your servants from the wall, and some of the king's men died. Moreover, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead." And this is what David replies in verse 25. David told the messenger, "Say this to Joab. Don't let this upset you. The sword devours one as well as another. Press the attack against the city and destroy it. Say this to encourage Joab." Now that strikes me as incredibly cold. He's been successful in engineering Uriah's death with Joab. Other of his own men have died as well. And this is all he can say. Don't let this upset you. Perhaps he feels, yeah, job done. I'm in the clear. And when Bathsheba has finished a period of mourning for the loss of her husband, David brings her into his home, marries her. Now, this is a dark chapter in so many ways, a difficult point in David's life in so many terrible ways, and not least in terms of his relationship with Joab. Because at this point, it's not just a case of David turning a blind eye to some of Joab's behaviour and failing to deal with it. Joab has actually been working with David to do something unlawful. So David has actually exploited this darker side of Joab's nature to his own advantage in order to bring about Uriah's death. Now what this means is that David has lost any kind of moral authority over Joab. Whatever sort of authority, superiority, control he may have had over the guy is now completely lost. And in fact, Joab now has something of a hold over David. Following Nathan the prophet's confrontation with David, of course, David repents deeply of his sin. However, there is still a lingering issue in terms of his relationship with Joab. As time goes on, we read of some very unpleasant family business involving rape and murder amongst members of David's own family. After which David's son Absalom conspires against him and subsequently leads a revolt. And David has to flee Jerusalem with what loyal members of his household and army he can, one of which is Joab. That situation ultimately ends in battle between Absalom's followers, whose army are led by a man called Amasa, and David's army led by Joab. And prior to the battle, David issues an order to Joab. He says, "Be gentle with the young man Absalom for my sake." The battle doesn't go Absalom's way. And there comes a point, actually, where Absalom is found hanging in a tree. And he's left there initially by the soldier who finds him, but then Joab hears of it, and he takes his personal bodyguard, and they chuck javelins into Absalom while he's hanging in the tree. Then they basically kill him, throw his body into a hole in the ground, cover it with rocks in the forest, and leave him there. And when David first hears about it, he grieves. There is a sort of a bit of a discussion between Joab and David about this, as you can imagine. I suppose Joab thought he was just doing what needed to be done and getting rid of a threat to the throne and to the nation, but he did disobey David's command. What's also interesting is that David replaces Joab as leader of the army with this man Amasa, who had been in charge of Absalom's forces. But in terms of managing Joab, in terms of seeing this as a way of, in some way, punishing his behaviour or trying to deal with him, it's far too little, too late. And this becomes clear shortly afterwards, so as you move into 2 Samuel chapter 20, when there's another revolt, this time led by a man called Sheba. And of course, again, there's a confrontation. David sends Amasa to muster the army to fight against Sheba and his followers. Joab and Abishai go out to the muster point to meet up with the troops. They arrive there, they meet Amasa, and Joab murders Amasa. He assumes control of the army. They pursue and defeat Sheba, and he returns to Jerusalem, and there he is, back in command of the army again. And it appears, we're not heard that David acts or responds to this in any way. Because, of course, what can he do? Joab has this leverage over him. Joab can just seize control of the army back, and David's powerless. So ultimately it's left to Solomon to clean up the mess. As you move on to the story in the early part of 1 Kings, David advises Solomon to deal with Joab, which he does ultimately. Joab flees to the sanctuary where he's pulled out and executed. So Joab's actions and David's failure to deal with them had far-reaching consequences that really it was left to somebody else to clean up. So what can we learn from all of this? Well, I suppose really it's to beware the creeping and insidious nature of compromise. So think about this relationship, If we wind it back all the way to the early days, before David is really established as king, Joab, Abishai, the sons of Zeruiah are supporters. They are alongside David, they are with him, helping him, they're a strength to him. So the relationship in the early days is positive. However, over time it becomes something else. And there becomes a point where the behaviour of Joab is so outrageous that really it needs to be dealt with. And that's the first critical point where there is wrong, and the wrong requires a line to be drawn and a response to be made, and it isn't. Then later there is another critical point beyond that, where actually David and Joab become partners in crime. So the dark and negative nature of the other individual is not only tolerated and ignored, it's embraced. And at that point, the relationship is in deep, deep trouble. So what does this mean for us? So think about relationships, think about situations. I mean, for me, I suppose the place where I come across this is really at work, where there may be a behaviour, an attitude, an action that you recognise as being wrong, that you recognise as not being something you should get involved with. And initially, and maybe successfully to an extent, you can't try and distance yourself from it. You try and avoid it, avoid any association with it, maybe even make it clear that this has nothing to do with you, as David did at Abner's funeral. But sometimes that's not enough. Sometimes it requires us to take a stand. And that's really not easy, especially if you feel this sense of dependence in that relationship and in that situation. So if for example, the behaviour is by a colleague or a senior member of staff, an employer, a boss, then it's not easy at all to take a stand. And you may, like David, feel that you are powerless, just as he felt powerless to deal with Joab and Abishai. And at that point, we need to turn to the Lord for strength. We need his help to make a stand. We need his power to come into that situation and deal with it so that we can stand firm and make a stand. Of course, it can go beyond that. It can go beyond a situation of turning a blind eye to a bad thing, to us actually becoming fully compromised in the sense that we become complicit. We become a partner in crime with the individual, with the situation. And that means we're in deep trouble, I think. But at that point, the situation can be retrieved. You know, we can trust in God to set us back on the right path if we turn to him, ask his forgiveness, recognise what we've done wrong, and ask him to restore us. And there's an interesting contrast here between the nature of the compromise that happens to David in his relationship with Joab over a very long period of time, the way it sneaks in there until it becomes extremely difficult for him to deal with it. And the out and out, upfront temptation that David faced with Bathsheba, which in a sense was far more obvious, but of course he also failed to deal with. And I think it's important for us to remember that not all of the enemy activity that we face in our lives that seeks to trip us up and bring us down is overt, like David lusting after Bathsheba. Some of it is a creeping compromise of which we need to be on our guard against. So let's pray for wisdom, discernment and strength to deal with those situations in our own lives.